I'm going to be talking about Prebiotic Photochemistry Day. And we've actually heard quite a bit about photochemistry, so that's one of the benefits of going towards the end of the conference. I get to invoke a lot of what other people have already discussed. And in particular, I'm going to be talking about how we can use photochemistry to build bigger molecules. We've talked a lot about photostability and how that can be really important so we don't break up molecules. But I'm going to be talking more about how we can make bigger molecules using photochemistry. So I think it's important to define what I mean when I'm talking about molecular complexity. You can think about complexity as just having a large mixture of lots of molecules, but in this case, I really do mean forming bigger molecules. So how do we form covalent bonds without biology in a prebiotic setting? And so if you have simple molecules, like our favorite fatty acids we've been talking about a lot, how did we get from those simple prebiotically available molecules to the more complex biomolecules that are actually needed for life? And so I'll be talking about quite a bit this model system for making simple double-tailed lipids, where we sort of are in an intermediate region of chemical space between these simple single-tailed fatty acids and the much more complex phospholipids that are in modern cells. And so there's a way of doing this photochemically using a very simple system. But before I get into the specifics, I want to step back a little bit and talk about both prebiotic chemistry and photochemistry in general. And so again, we've heard a lot about how prebiotic chemistry is sort of how you go from simple systems to complex systems. And that's great, except that there's always the back reaction of going back from a complex system to a more simple one. And so if we're thinking about a system that isn't being driven in some sense, there's always going to be an equilibrium. And even if your equilibrium is thermodynamically favoring this more complex system, you're still kind of going to be stuck in this equilibrium state. And so you generally need a driving force to maintain disequilibrium, which is often an input of energy. And so if you just think about going from simple processes to the more complex things, including life, you're maintaining disequilibrium. And so when we need to think about energy sources, there are lots of different prebiotic energy sources you can pick. And we've heard a lot about a lot of these. But solar radiation is a really attractive energy source for a couple of different reasons. One of which, it's just a much larger energy source than anything else that would have been available. This particular study was only looking at UV light that was less than 250 nanometers, which is clearly not all of the light in the system. But even that is over a couple of orders of magnitude more energy from the sun than the other sources. And it's also important to think about photochemistry and light from the sun, because photochemistry is fundamentally different than thermal chemistry. Thermal chemistry, you have a bath of molecules in, say, an aqueous environment, and you heat it up, and you're all just jostling around. The whole system is moving, and it's generally not particularly specific. Whereas with photochemistry, you have a specific molecule that absorbs light at a certain energy range, and you can excite a single molecule or a single type of molecule in a solution while the bath remains low and the other molecules are not necessarily excited. And photochemistry is also sort of inherently a non-equilibrium system because you're exciting the molecule. And it's also very dependent on which molecule you choose, what chemistry you're going to get out, if you're going to get out any chemistry. All right, so we've seen a plot from Parker that was based on a lot of the same data. But what conditions are we talking about when we're talking about the young sun during the prebiotic conditions? So we have a few things on here. So we have the sort of modern extraterrestrial solar spectrum outside the atmosphere. And then we have this model of the young sun of about 3.8 billion years ago. And then I've also put the current surface spectrum on here. So it's this sun, but looking at it sort of on the surface. So what light is making it through? And of course, we see this really distinct cutoff at 290 nanometers, which is where ozone is cutting off the UV light. But you notice the changes we're seeing in the solar spectrum due to the atmosphere are sort of the same order of magnitude, for lack of a better word, as the changes of several billion years of solar evolution. And so it's really important to think about what prebiotic atmospheric filters we're going to have. And We have guesses for what the prebiotic atmosphere was and what filters there would be. They're not, I would say, particularly well constrained. But most people agree that most of the wavelengths of light at about less than 200 nanometers would be pretty much filtered by the time you get to the surface of the Earth, and that there would be some attenuation between 200 and 250 nanometers. So we've heard a lot about sort of the more UV that's given off by the younger sun, but most of that it really is out in this higher UV range that wouldn't necessarily make it all the way down to the surface of the Earth, where we're at least considering doing useful photochemistry. But there is sort of this almost 100 nanometer range of sort of quote unquote useful UV, near UV radiation that can help build chemical complexity. And so, as I was saying, photochemistry is molecule specific, but it's also very environmentally specific. And so we were saying we don't necessarily know a lot about the early Earth conditions during this period of prebiotic chemistry. I think we're all pretty well agreed that there were oceans or water of some variety. We have guesses with nitrogen and CO2 for what the atmosphere was. There are different estimates of whether there would have been, say, organic hazes to help filter some of the UV light out. And then other people have estimated sort of what minerals and land there would be. But for our purposes, we generally try to keep it really simple. So we use aqueous environments and we use sunlight. And so one of the molecules we use is pyruvic acid here. It's an oxoacid. And so it's got a carboxylic acid and then a ketone. And most of your photochemistry and where you absorb light is going to be controlled by what functional groups are in your molecule. So here we see the absorption spectrum for the gas phase pyruvic acid. And you notice that the aqueous phase pyruvic acid is blue shifted. So where these electronic states are lying really does change as to whether it's a gas phase species or an aqueous phase species. But if we use this longer-tailed alkyl oxoacid, 2-OA, it really hasn't changed much from the aqueous phase pyruvic acid. So the alkyl tail isn't changing much of the electronic structure here. And we got a good overview of Jablonski diagrams earlier today, so I won't have to go into it in too much detail. But this is for pyruvic acid. It's just a cartoon sketch of what goes on with the photochemistry here. But basically, you absorb a light, you go up to this singlet n-pi star manifold, and then in the gas phase, the molecule falls apart into methyl hydroxycarbene, and then can go on to make small molecule products. But as soon as you're in aqueous phase, you now can intersystem cross to this triplet state via a conical intersection, and you can get really interesting products. And so when we're talking about what the triplet state is doing, it interacts with another pyruvic acid. In this case, this is the diol, but there's an equilibrium between the pyruvic acid and the diol in aqueous solution. And it decarboxylates, and it generates two organic radicals. And the organic radicals can go on to make a number of products. But the one we're going to focus on in particular is this. This is dimethyl-tartaric acid. So by absorbing light in a 3-carbon molecule, decarboxylating, and then making a radical, we can recombine 2 of these radicals to form a 6-carbon molecule. So you're making a carbon-carbon bond, and you're essentially dimerizing the molecule. And so that's cool for a lot of reasons, but it's especially interesting if you stick alkyl tails on here instead of methyls. Because then, suddenly, you have a way of going from a simple single-tailed surfactant that's prebiotically plausible to a simple double-tailed surfactant, which is really interesting because generally there hasn't been a great abiotic way of making double-tailed lipids. It's not a phospholipid, but it's sort of in this region of chemical space in between the single-tailed carboxylic acids and the phospholipids. It's also really interesting because we start well below the aggregation concentration of the single-tailed lipid, the 2-OA. But upon photolysis and no further perturbation of the system, you actually see the solution turn cloudy. And so we're getting self-assembly of these, we're getting self-assembly as the photolysis proceeds, as we're forming these double-tailed molecules, because double-tailed molecules generally have a lower critical sort of aggregation concentration. And we've done a little bit of initial characterization of these guys. They are pretty monodisperse in size, at about 100 nanometers in radius, and we can tell that they are spherical. So basically, they're too big to be micelles. We haven't definitively proven that they're vesicles, but they're of the correct size to be vesicles. And even if they are just sort of ordered aggregates, that's a really interesting phase of self-assembly to get something that's so monodispersed in size. So we're still working to characterize this, but in the next couple of minutes, I want to talk about this other chemistry, or using the same idea of chemistry that we're really excited about right now. So again, we've got these organic radicals, and when you're in a solution of pyruvic acid, it makes sense that these two are going to recombine to make the molecules come together. But in a prebiotic system, you're not just going to have a single molecule floating around doing chemistry with itself. And so if we can come up with a way to use these photoactive organic radicals as drivers for further chemistry, that's really interesting. And so these are initial results that we're finishing up right here. But basically, we can take pyruvic acid. It also works for 2-OA. And we can take a short-tailed carboxylic acid, so in this case, hexanoic acid, and we can hydrogen abstract from the hexanoic acid to form a radical here. And then we do see, it's a minor product given how our experimental constraints, but we do see both the pyruvic and the hexanoic acid, these radicals coming together, and we see a mixed product between the two. And so if that's the case, then we really have developed sort of a primitive, or a fairly robust system for generating primitive lipids, double-tailed lipids, both with two oxoacids coming together, but also being able to take a molecule like a carboxylic acid that it's not itself photoactive and can't do photochemistry, but we can use the photoactive species as drivers for further chemistry. And with that, I just want to thank everybody. You've seen this picture 3 times, but
Thank you. Any questions? Does it work better on aerosols or in the liquid?
Well, yeah, so I didn't talk about that today. So these molecules are surfactant molecules. They are going to partition to the surface. And we, in our group, an atmospheric chemistry group, really like to think about aerosols, which have a very large surface area to volume ratio. And so you can get a much higher relative concentration in these little aerosols that have so much surface area. And so probably, I mean, it's a surface area argument if you're getting a concentration thing. So we would love to do it on aerosols, but this was bulk studies, actually.
Yeah, I'm used to seeing aerosols from your group, so I'm just like, oh, aerosols.
Yeah, no, I didn't talk about them today.
Perfect for aerosols.
Yeah.
All right.
All right.
That appears to be all. Thank you very much.